The forest ranger's morning coffee was still steaming when he heard the footsteps. Not the usual sounds of wildlife moving through the underbrush, but something different, something deliberate, something that made his years of experience whisper a warning in the back of his mind. He set down his mug and stepped toward the cabin door, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. Emerging from the tall grass, moving with purpose across the open savanna, was a sight that defied every protocol he'd ever learned. A massive lioness, her golden coat catching the early morning light, was approaching his station. But this wasn't a territorial display or a hunting approach. This was something entirely unprecedented, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the relationship between predator and protector. The lioness carried something precious in her powerful jaws, a small bundle that barely moved, its tiny form limp and vulnerable against her massive frame. As she drew closer, the ranger's heart began to pound with a mixture of terror and disbelief. This apex predator, this creature that should view him as either threat or prey, was walking directly toward his front door with what appeared to be an injured cub. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to slam the door and call for backup. His training had been clear about maintaining distance from wild predators, especially protective mothers. But something in the lioness's approach stopped him cold. There was no aggression in her movements, no stalking posture or warning signals. Instead, her amber eyes held something he'd never seen before in a wild predator: desperation. The ranger stood frozen in his doorway as the lioness approached the wooden steps of his cabin. Time seemed suspended as predator and human locked eyes across a distance that represented millions of years of evolutionary fear. Then, with movements so gentle they seemed impossible from such a powerful creature, the lioness lowered her head and placed the small cub on his doorstep. The tiny body was motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of labored breathing. Dark stains marked the cub's shoulder, where wounds had torn through its fur, and its small paws barely twitched with life. The lioness stepped back just slightly, but her gaze never left the ranger's face. In that moment, every barrier between species seemed to dissolve, replaced by something far more primal and universal: the plea of a mother for her dying child. The ranger's hands trembled as he processed what was happening. This wasn't just unprecedented. It was impossible according to everything he'd studied about animal behavior. Wild predators didn't seek help from humans. They certainly didn't trust them with their most precious possessions. Yet here was living proof that desperation could transcend the most fundamental survival instincts. He knelt slowly beside the injured cub, his movements careful and deliberate. The lioness tensed, but didn't retreat. Her massive body coiled like a spring ready to explode into action if he made one wrong move. The cub's breathing was shallow and irregular, its small chest barely rising with each struggled breath. The wounds on its shoulder were deep and jagged, clearly the result of a vicious attack that had nearly claimed its life. The silence between human and predator was deafening. No roar of warning, no growl of threat, just the weight of absolute trust placed in the most unlikely hands. The ranger understood the magnitude of what was being asked of him. This lioness had overcome millions of years of genetic programming, had pushed past every survival instinct to place her child's fate in his hands. Moving with surgical precision, he gathered the small body in his arms, feeling the faint warmth of life still flickering within. The cub weighed almost nothing, its tiny frame fragile as glass in his hands. As he lifted the injured animal, the lioness followed his every movement with laser focus, her powerful muscles ready to spring into action at the first sign of threat to her young. Inside his cabin, the ranger's emergency medical supplies suddenly became a makeshift veterinary clinic. His hands worked quickly but gently, cleaning wounds that spoke of a brutal encounter with something far larger and more aggressive. The injuries were consistent with territorial attacks, the kind that dominant males inflicted on cubs that threatened their genetic legacy. It was nature at its most ruthless, and this small victim had barely survived. Meanwhile, the lioness had positioned herself at the cabin door, her massive head resting on the very step where she'd placed her cub. She made no attempt to enter, respecting some invisible boundary, but her vigil was absolute. Her presence was a constant reminder of the trust that had been placed, and the consequences if that trust was betrayed. Working through the night, the ranger battled to stabilize the tiny patient. Every supply in his medical kit was put to use as he cleaned wounds, applied antiseptics, and carefully sutured torn flesh. The cub's vital signs remained weak but steady, each breath a small victory in the fight for survival. Outside, the lioness maintained her silent watch, a golden statue against the darkness. As dawn began to break across the savannah, the ranger knew his makeshift treatment could only go so far. The cub's injuries required advanced medical intervention that his remote nearest veterinary facility was hours away, and stations simply couldn't provide. Instead, transporting the cub would mean testing the lioness's trust to its absolute limits. The decision was agonizing. Leave the cub here and hope his basic treatment would be enough, or risk everything on a desperate journey to get professional help. The lioness seemed to sense his dilemma, her amber eyes following his every movement as he prepared for what would be the most dangerous gamble of his career. Loading the cub into a transport crate, padding its injured body with soft materials, the ranger prepared to leave the safety of his cabin. The lioness rose immediately, her powerful frame tensing with protective fury as she watched her child being carried away. Every instinct should have told her to attack, to reclaim her young from this potential threat. Instead, after a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she made a choice that defied all logic. She followed, maintaining a respectful but determined distance. The lioness escorted the vehicle across the vast savannah toward the veterinary station. Her silent presence was both protection and warning, a reminder that the precious cargo belonged to her, and that any betrayal would be met with swift and deadly consequences. What happened next would test the boundaries of trust between species and reveal a truth about the intelligence and emotional depth of these magnificent predators that few humans had ever witnessed. The journey ahead would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of faith come from the most unexpected sources, and that the bond between parent and child truly knows no boundaries. The veterinary station loomed ahead, representing both hope and the ultimate test of an impossible alliance forged in desperation and sealed with trust. The veterinary facility appeared like a beacon of hope against the golden expanse, its modern structure standing in stark contrast to the ancient wilderness surrounding it. Dr. Sarah Chen was conducting her morning rounds when the radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission that would challenge everything she thought she knew about wildlife behavior. The sight that greeted her outside the facility was beyond comprehension. A park ranger's vehicle sat idling in the dust, its human occupant moving with careful deliberation as he unloaded a small transport crate. But what captured her attention completely was the magnificent predator maintaining a vigilant watch from the shadows of nearby trees. The lioness stood motionless, her powerful frame coiled with tension, amber eyes tracking every movement of the humans handling her most precious cargo. Dr. Chen had treated thousands of wild animals throughout her career, but never under circumstances like these. The usual protocol involved sedated creatures brought in by rangers or researchers, not conscious predators who had voluntarily sought human intervention. This lioness hadn't been captured or cornered. She had chosen to be here, and that choice carried weight that pressed down on everyone present. The examination revealed the full extent of the cub's trauma. X-rays painted a grim picture of internal injuries that went far beyond the visible wounds. Fractured ribs, internal bleeding, and tissue damage that spoke of a vicious assault designed to eliminate a perceived threat. The attack had been methodical, brutal, and nearly fatal. Only the lioness's quick intervention and desperate gamble had saved her offspring from certain death. Surgery was the only option, but it meant hours of separation between mother and child. Hours during which the lioness would have to trust completely in the intentions of creatures she had been programmed by evolution to fear. The operating theater became a stage for the most delicate dance between human skill and wild faith ever witnessed. Outside the surgical suite, the lioness had positioned herself where she could maintain visual contact with the building. She neither paced nor showed signs of agitation. Instead, she demonstrated a patience that seemed almost supernatural, as if she understood that healing required time, and that interference would only jeopardize her cub's chances. The surgical team worked with meticulous precision, repairing internal damage and stabilizing vital organs. Every procedure was performed with the knowledge that failure meant not just the loss of a young life, but the potential destruction of trust between species that might never be rebuilt. The weight of that responsibility guided every decision, every careful incision, every delicate suture. Hours passed like days. The lioness maintained her vigil as the sun traced its arc across the sky, her presence a constant reminder of the stakes involved. Staff members found themselves glancing toward the windows, checking on their unusual guardian, marveling at the discipline and faith being displayed by this apex predator. As evening approached, the surgery finally concluded. The cub's vital signs had stabilized, its breathing steady and strong. The internal bleeding had been stopped, fractured bones set, and damaged tissues repaired. But the real test was yet to come. Recovery would determine whether this desperate gamble had truly succeeded or merely delayed the inevitable. The reunion between mother and offspring was orchestrated with extraordinary care. The cub, still groggy from anesthesia, was placed in a recovery area visible through reinforced glass. The lioness approached slowly, her massive paws silent against the concrete. When she saw her young one breathing peacefully, wrapped in clean bandages, something shifted in her demeanor. The tension that had defined her presence since arriving at the facility seemed to melt away, replaced by something that could only be described as relief. She settled beside the glass barrier, as close to her cub as the physical structure would allow, and began what would become a 3-day vigil of recovery and healing. The veterinary staff had never witnessed anything like the lioness's behavior during those crucial days. She accepted food and water brought by brave volunteers, but never moved more than a few feet from her cub's recovery area. Her presence seemed to accelerate the healing process, as if the young one drew strength from knowing its protector remained near. On the 3rd day, the cub opened its eyes and attempted to stand. The wounds had begun to heal cleanly, vital signs remained strong, and the spark of life had returned to its small frame. The moment of truth had arrived. Would the lioness trust these humans enough to allow her cub to complete its recovery? Or would maternal instincts override the unprecedented cooperation that had brought them this far? The answer came in the form of another impossible gesture. As the veterinary team prepared to extend the cub's stay for additional monitoring, the lioness did something that defied all logic. She retreated from the facility, moving back toward the tree line, but not disappearing entirely. Instead, she established a new watching post at a distance, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to signal continued trust in the healing process. This wasn't abandonment. This was acknowledgement that her cub was in capable hands, and that her constant presence might actually hinder the recovery she so desperately wanted to see. The intelligence and emotional sophistication required for such a decision challenged every assumption about wild animal behavior and cognitive ability. Days turned into weeks as the cub regained strength under professional care. The lioness maintained her distant vigil, occasionally visiting the facility's perimeter but never interfering with the treatment process. It was as if she had appointed herself as silent supervisor of her offspring's recovery, trusting but verifying that promises were being kept. The healing process revealed something remarkable about the bond between the ranger and the lioness. She seemed to recognize him as the catalyst who had made this miracle possible, acknowledging his presence with subtle gestures that spoke of gratitude beyond words. A brief eye contact here, a moment of relaxed posture there, small signs that trust had been earned and would be remembered. As the cub grew stronger and more active, preparations began for its eventual release back into the wild. This transition would require careful coordination to ensure the young predator could successfully reunite with its mother and readjust to life in its natural habitat. The process would test the bonds forged during this extraordinary rescue one final time. But the story was far from over. The relationship established between human and predator during those desperate hours would prove to have consequences neither could have anticipated. Trust, once given and honored, creates obligations that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. The lioness had learned something compass about humanian that would reshape her understanding of the world, while the humans involved had glimpsed intelligence and emotional depth and forever changed their approach wildlife that will to conservation. The stage was set for a reunion that would prove whether this unprecedented alliance could survive the return to the natural order of the savanna. The moment of release arrived, with the soft light of early morning painting the savanna in shades of gold and amber. The veterinary team had spent weeks preparing for this critical transition, knowing that the success of their unprecedented rescue would ultimately be measured by the cub's ability to survive in the wild. The small transport crate sat ready, its occupant now strong enough to face the world that had nearly claimed its life. Dr. Chen conducted one final examination, her experienced hands checking the healed wounds that had brought this remarkable patient to her facility. The scars would remain as permanent reminders of survival, but the underlying injuries had healed completely. The cub's eyes were bright and alert, its movements confident and playful. Every medical indicator suggested a complete recovery, but the real test lay ahead in the unforgiving landscape of the African wilderness. The lioness had sensed the approaching moment. Her distant vigil had intensified over the previous days, moving closer to the facility's perimeter with each passing hour. She seemed to understand that the time for separation was ending, that her patient faith was about to be rewarded. The intelligence required for such anticipation continued to astound everyone involved in the rescue operation. The journey back to the release site retraced the desperate path taken weeks earlier, but under vastly different circumstances. Where once there had been panic and uncertainty, now there was hope and careful planning. The cub traveled in comfort, its injuries fully healed, its strength restored. The lioness followed at her customary respectful distance, but her posture had changed dramatically. No longer the desperate mother pleading for help, she now moved with the confident stride of a predator who knew her gamble had paid off. The release location had been carefully selected based on territorial patterns and resource availability. It needed to provide adequate cover for the reunion while offering escape routes if the reintroduction process encountered complications. The veterinary team had studied the area extensively, mapping water sources, prey movements, and potential threats that might impact the cub's survival chances. As the transport crate was positioned in the chosen clearing, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. This moment represented the culmination of an extraordinary journey that had challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and wild predators. Success would validate the lioness's impossible trust, while failure would transform a miracle into a tragedy. The crate door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo across the vast expanse. For a moment, nothing happened. The cub remained inside, perhaps uncertain about this transition back to the world of its birth. Then, slowly, cautiously, the small predator emerged into the dappled sunlight filtering through the scattered trees. The lioness had positioned herself at the edge of the clearing, her powerful frame motionless as she watched her offspring take its first steps back into the wild. The distance between them seemed to stretch like an eternity, filled with the weight of everything that had transpired since that desperate morning when she had first approached the ranger's cabin. The cub's movements were tentative at first, testing legs that had grown stronger during captivity, reacquainting itself with the feel of natural earth beneath its paws. Its head lifted, nostrils flaring as it caught familiar scents carried on the warm breeze. Somewhere in its developing consciousness, recognition was dawning. This was home. The reunion unfolded with a grace that left the human observers speechless. The lioness approached slowly, her massive paws making no sound against the soft ground. When she reached her offspring, the greeting was both tender and profound. A gentle nuzzle, a protective stance, a moment of contact that seemed to heal more than just physical wounds. But the lioness's behavior held another surprise that would cement her place in conservation history. After ensuring her cub was safe and responsive, she turned toward the human observers. Her amber eyes found the ranger who had first answered her desperate plea, holding his gaze for a long, meaningful moment. What passed between them was beyond words, an acknowledgement that transcended species barriers. The gesture that followed defied all expectations. The lioness approached the small group of humans, stopping just outside what would normally be considered a safe distance. She lowered her massive head in what could only be interpreted as a bow, a gesture of gratitude so profound that several witnesses found themselves moved to tears. This apex predator, this creature who owed humans nothing according to natural law, was expressing thanks in the only way she knew how. The moment lasted only seconds, but its impact would resonate for years to come. The lioness then returned to her cub, and together they began to move toward the deeper wilderness. The reunion was complete, the rescue successful, but the bonds forged during those desperate weeks would prove to have lasting consequences. As the human team prepared to depart, they carried with them more than just the satisfaction of a successful wildlife intervention. They had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence, emotional capacity, and the potential for cooperation between species. The lioness had demonstrated cognitive abilities that included planning, trust assessment, and delayed gratification on a level rarely documented in wild predators. The implications extended far beyond this single rescue. Conservation strategies worldwide would need to be reconsidered in light of what had been learned about predator behavior and decision-making capabilities. The lioness had proven that wild animals were capable of far more complex reasoning than previously believed, opening new avenues for human-wildlife cooperation. Months passed, and the savanna returned to its natural rhythms. The cub grew stronger and more independent, learning the skills necessary for survival under its mother's careful guidance. The scars from its early trauma faded, but never disappeared entirely, serving as permanent reminders of the miraculous intervention that had saved its life. The ranger continued his conservation work, but with a fundamentally changed perspective on the creatures he was sworn to protect. His encounters with wildlife now carried an added dimension of respect for their intelligence and emotional depth. The experience had transformed him from a protector into a partner, recognizing that effective conservation required understanding animals as complex beings capable of rational thought and emotional connection. The veterinary facility incorporated lessons learned from the unprecedented case into their treatment protocols. Dr. Chen published papers documenting the lioness's behavior, contributing valuable insights to the scientific understanding of predator psychology and cognitive abilities. The case became a landmark study in animal intelligence and cross-species cooperation. But perhaps the most significant impact was yet to come. The lioness's trust in human intervention had created a precedent that would influence her behavior in future encounters. She had learned that humans could be allies rather than threats, a lesson that would prove crucial when circumstances again demanded impossible choices. The stage was being set for another chapter in this extraordinary relationship, one that would test the bonds forged during that desperate rescue and prove that gratitude in the wild has a longer memory than anyone had dared imagine. The savanna held its secrets closely, but some stories demand to be told, especially when they reveal truths about the hidden connections that bind all living creatures together. The real test of trust was still approaching, waiting in the shadows of the scattered trees, where predator and protector would meet again under circumstances that neither could predict. The months that followed brought a deceptive calm to the vast expanse of wilderness where the remarkable rescue had taken place. The ranger resumed his regular patrols, documenting wildlife movements and monitoring the delicate balance that governed life in this unforgiving landscape. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the creatures he was sworn to protect. Every encounter now carried the weight of possibility, the knowledge that intelligence and emotion existed far beyond what textbooks had taught him. The lioness and her cub had vanished into the deeper territories, becoming part of the natural rhythm that pulsed through the savanna. Occasional sightings confirmed their continued presence, but always at a distance that respected the boundaries between wild and civilized worlds. The cub grew stronger with each passing week, its movements becoming more confident as it learned the ancient lessons of survival from its devoted mother. Winter arrived with its subtle changes, bringing cooler nights and shifting prey patterns that demanded adaptation from every creature inhabiting this harsh paradise. The ranger found himself working longer hours, his duties expanding as seasonal challenges tested both wildlife and conservation efforts. It was during one of these extended patrols that fate would once again demonstrate its unpredictable nature. The mechanical failure struck without warning on a remote stretch of savanna, where communication towers struggled to reach and backup remained hours away. The ranger's vehicle sputtered to a halt, its engine dying with a finality that sent ice through his veins despite the warm afternoon air. He attempted several restarts, each failed effort echoing across the emptiness with increasing desperation. The radio crackled with static, confirming his worst fears about their current location. Stepping out to inspect the engine, he felt the oppressive weight of isolation settle around him like a suffocating blanket. The silence was too complete, too heavy with unspoken threats. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when the natural world held its breath, waiting for something to happen. His hand moved instinctively toward his emergency supplies, but deep down he knew that preparation could only go so far in a landscape where humans remained perpetual outsiders. The first sound that broke the unnatural quiet was a low, menacing cackle that raised every hair on his arms. Then another, followed by a chorus of voices that spoke of hunger and opportunity discovered. From the tall grass surrounding his disabled vehicle, shapes began to emerge with calculated precision. A pack of spotted hyenas, their powerful jaws designed for crushing bone, their intelligence focused on the vulnerable prey that had stumbled into their territory. The ranger scrambled back toward his vehicle, but the thin metal shell offered little protection against creatures built for persistence and equipped with jaws capable of bending steel. The hyenas began their methodical approach, circling with the patience of predators who understood that time was their greatest weapon. Their cackling calls grew louder, more confident, as they assessed the situation and planned their attack. Terror gripped him as the pack tightened their formation, cutting off every avenue of escape. His radio remained stubbornly silent, mocking his desperate attempts to raise help from the distant base station. The hyenas pressed closer, their muscular bodies moving with deadly purpose as they prepared to close the trap they had so expertly constructed around their helpless prey. But the savanna held more than just death and desperation. Somewhere in the distance, powerful ears had detected the commotion. Ancient instincts stirred, recognizing sounds that spoke of conflict and danger. A debt unpaid suddenly demanded attention, calling forth a response that would defy every law of natural behavior and territorial boundaries. The ground began to vibrate with approaching footsteps that carried the weight of absolute authority. The hyena's confident cackling faltered as new scents reached their sensitive noses, scents that spoke of apex predators moving with deadly intent. Their formation wavered as uncertainty crept into their calculated assault, survival instincts warring with hunger as they sensed the approaching storm. A roar erupted across the savanna with such power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. This was no ordinary territorial challenge, but the sound of righteous fury given voice. The hyenas froze in confusion as their prey suddenly became secondary to a threat they hadn't anticipated, couldn't understand, and definitely couldn't ignore. From a cluster of trees burst two magnificent forms moving with breathtaking speed and coordination. The lioness, now fully mature and radiating deadly confidence, charged toward the pack with her offspring beside her. No longer the small, injured cub that had once fought for life, the young lion had grown into a formidable predator in its own right, its movements perfectly synchronized with its mother's devastating assault. The hyenas scattered like leaves before a hurricane, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of overwhelming force. Those too slow to retreat found themselves confronting predators motivated by something far more powerful than territorial instinct or hunger. This was gratitude transformed into action, debt payment delivered with interest, loyalty given form through deadly precision. The ranger watched in stunned amazement as his unlikely saviors systematically dismantled the threat that had seemed so insurmountable moments before. The lioness moved with surgical precision, cutting off escape routes and driving the pack toward open ground where they could be more effectively scattered. Her offspring followed her lead with impressive skill, demonstrating lessons learned not just from survival training, but from watching humans work together during those critical weeks of recovery. Within minutes, the hyenas had been completely routed, their retreat carrying them far from the scene of their failed ambush. The immediate danger had passed, but the true miracle was yet to unfold. Instead of disappearing back into the wilderness, the lioness and her offspring took up protective positions around the disabled vehicle, transforming from fierce attackers into silent guardians. The ranger remained motionless, hardly daring to believe what was happening. These apex predators, creatures who owed him nothing according to natural law, had not only saved his life, but were now actively protecting him. The lioness occasionally glanced in his direction, her amber eyes holding recognition, and something that could only be described as determination. She had not forgotten the debt incurred during those desperate days, and repayment would be delivered in full. For nearly an hour, the unlikely guardians maintained their vigil. They positioned themselves strategically, ensuring clear sight lines in all directions, while remaining close enough to respond instantly to any renewed threat. The young lion stood tall and alert, its presence serving as a warning to any predator foolish enough to test their resolve. The sound of approaching engines finally broke the surreal tableau. Backup had arrived, drawn by the ranger's earlier distress calls that had somehow penetrated the communication barriers. As the rescue vehicles crested a distant hill, the lioness and her offspring rose to their feet with synchronized grace. What happened next would forever change the ranger's understanding of animal memory and emotional capacity. The lioness approached his position, stopping just outside what would normally be considered a safe distance. She held his gaze for a long, profound moment, and in her amber eyes he saw acknowledgement of the circle that had been completed. The debt had been paid, the trust honored, the impossible alliance proven genuine. Without a sound, the magnificent pair turned and melted back into the vast wilderness from which they had emerged. They sought no recognition, no reward, only the satisfaction of honor fulfilled and loyalty demonstrated. The ranger stood beside his disabled vehicle, his legs trembling not from fear, but from the emotional impact of witnessing something that challenged every assumption about the natural world. His rescue team found him in a state of profound contemplation, struggling to explain an encounter that defied scientific logic, while affirming deeper truths about connection and gratitude that transcended species boundaries. The disabled vehicle was repaired, the immediate crisis resolved, but the implications of what had occurred would resonate far beyond that single afternoon on the savannah. The lioness had proven that trust, once earned and honored, creates bonds that endure across time and circumstance. Her intervention demonstrated intelligence, planning, and emotional sophistication that demanded recognition and respect from the conservation community. Most importantly, she had shown that the relationship between humans and wildlife could evolve beyond the traditional predator-prey dynamic into something approaching genuine partnership. This extraordinary demonstration of loyalty and gratitude would become legendary among wildlife researchers and conservationists, providing evidence that emotional connections between species were not only possible, but could influence behavior in ways previously thought impossible. The implications extended far beyond a single rescue, suggesting new approaches to conservation that recognized animals as intelligent partners rather than subjects to be managed. The savannah returned to its eternal rhythms, but the echo of that remarkable afternoon continued to resonate through the conservation community and beyond. Trust had been given, honored, and repaid with interest, creating a legacy that would influence human-wildlife relationships for generations to come. The lioness had written her own chapter in the ongoing story of cooperation between species, proving that gratitude knows no boundaries and that the bonds forged in desperation can endure long after the crisis has passed. This incredible story reveals a profound truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about the natural world. The lioness, who once approached a human cabin in desperate need, had transformed a moment of crisis into a lifetime bond that transcended every barrier between species. Her actions proved that intelligence, memory, and gratitude exist far beyond what science had previously documented in wild predators. What began as an impossible plea for help became a testament to the emotional depth and cognitive abilities that exist throughout the animal kingdom. The lioness demonstrated planning, trust assessment, and delayed gratification on levels that demanded recognition and respect from researchers worldwide. Her willingness to overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming showed that desperation can indeed forge connections that endure long after the immediate crisis has passed. The ranger's experience fundamentally changed conservation approaches, proving that effective wildlife protection requires understanding animals as complex beings capable of rational thought and emotional connection. The veterinary team's documentation of this unprecedented case contributed invaluable insights to scientific understanding of predator psychology and cross-species cooperation. Perhaps most remarkably, this story demonstrates that gratitude in the wild has a longer memory than anyone had dared imagine. The lioness's intervention during the hyena attack proved that trust, once given and honored, creates obligations that extend far beyond the original crisis. She had learned that humans could be allies rather than threats, and when the opportunity arose to repay that debt, she acted without hesitation. This extraordinary encounter reminds us that empathy is truly a universal language, and that the bonds between all living creatures run deeper than we ever imagined. If this story of impossible trust and enduring gratitude moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of compassion. The connection between human and predator continues to inspire new approaches to conservation, proving that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected teachers.